without further ado, Dr. Roberts.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. I do this stuff for fun. So I'm going to take the screen and hopefully you see it now. And now the trick is, there we go. Boom. To show. Great. All right. This has been a lot of fun, and I wanted to open this presentation with a highly affirmative statement because I read a lot of local church histories, and this is, you may not think it, but this is a good one. And so I really had a good time with this, and there's a lot to work with. There's a lot to work with here. So thank you for listening to me. Sort of the beginning statement of the foundation of this church in 1874 was someone meets Reverend Marcus Hiram Cullum, and he's holding a religious service in the open under the trees. And so I just think that image of us going back in June and holding the service under the trees is very cool. The church in the neighborhood is in the river valley of the Trinity River, which is marked by profuse oak trees all along down to the coast. And if the tree, it's shifting focus, if the tree was noticing the humans carrying on below it, it may have noticed a slight difference in pigment from the humans in the area 40 years earlier. Humans have only been in this area for 11,000 years. And I say only to give you perspective from the tree. The first group that lived in this area was called the Clovis people. From 1500 to 1800, we know that the Plains Indians were here, and they gave way to the Apaches, who gave way to the Comanches, sometimes peacefully, usually not. In 1841, 35 years prior to the oak tree experience with Reverend Cullum, the Caddo Indian, who had been pushed here into the area by the Cherokee, were violently expelled by Anglos, who were intent on getting cheap land to create a slave state. Reverend Cullum here, who's in the lower center, was a farmer in Tennessee. He was not a slave owner. He became a Methodist minister, and he moved here in the 1870s. He had an astonishing number of children who had an astonishing number of children, and they built this church. If you look in the index of the prior history called the Oak Lawn Vision, it reads like the Cullum family directory. In the middle of the page are two of his grandchildren, Bob and Charles Cullum. They created the Tom Thumb grocery stores that we all know right after World War II. They're very wealthy. They supported the church. They were conservative theologically and conservative socially. The gay community, I don't know if you can see, but off in the corner here is Reverend Gene Leggett. That's that beautiful man in the lower right-hand corner. The gay community had been growing in Oak Lawn since 1940s, and gay Methodists looking for a faith home came to Oak Lawn United Methodist Church. Reverend Leggett here was leader of a queer Methodist group called Affirmation. People like Ed Young of that group brought their considerable talents to the church. In 1989, the old guard rejected the gifts that they brought, and Charles Cullum in the Oak Lawn Vision called it an affirmation of Oak Lawn's traditional biblical, moral, and spiritual values. And so that's the history up to 1989, and we're going to pick it up from there. This is the new work. See if I can use the screen. There we go. And let's cover the first, say, 20 years. In the first decade after the 1989 vote, the church observed a recurring set of programming with events like they were called things like Sneaker Day or the Jazz Mass, Celebration Sunday, the Possum Hunt, the birthday party for baby Jesus. It was an annual calendar, and it recurred every year. It had a real old-timey feel. And if you read the documents from that time, the church continually mentions its history, and it continually mentions the building a lot. Seems like every year they were counting off the number of years we've been in existence. Reading the history, reading the records, it feels like a church program a little bit for Warden June Cleaver. It was greatly loved, but as time went on, it was clear that it was hard on the ministers and it was hard on the volunteers who expressed weariness and the need for relief. The Sunday school program was very strong in the church. There was always about 6 Sunday school classes, and some were very possessive of their meeting rooms, even if it could be better used by another group. In fact, as time went on, the ministers would try to talk to the church and say, look, the issue that we have with new members is they often drift away. And they called the retention problem the need for discipleship, but there was not room to grow and move. Except for the gay community, the church was open to others. It was surprisingly open to others. It was not, it's not a family church. There is a reference in 2002, there was a study that was done and said the church is welcoming, but it's not inviting. And what they meant by that was that once you're in the doors, you were very welcome. They showed you around, they invited you to class and so forth, but there was nothing to draw you inside the door. It just wasn't engaging. Another thing that's interesting, it's a little outside this period, is we had an entire Korean Christian church meeting with us. Started in 1971. It ended sometime in the 80s, not clear exactly when. But this idea of co-locating a non-English language church is something that is well within the DNA of our church, and obviously it's continuing now. Reverend Gutierrez walked out of the 1989 church vote with a passion to extend the ministry of the church into the Hispanic part of the neighborhood, which was very significant. He instituted La Posada, so that was happening in the early 90s. Children's Arts Sundays. His associate, a guy named George Holcomb, and lay members learned Spanish, and they went to school board meetings and community meetings. They bought the community house, which is where Union is now, and they offered it to Hispanic community groups. They really were trying to bring in this community into the church. And Reverend Gutierrez, in one of his last reports to the church, talked about his great joy in seeing the diversity of children at the children's sermon. So he had a real passion for opening up beyond the white members of the church. As an act of faith, the church took on significant debt for 2 new pieces of property during this time. One was the community house. The other is the Wellborn property, just south of Wellborn, or southwest of Wellborn. Took on debt. And of course, it took a lot of time, talent, and money to keep the historic building going. I mean, there's constant renovation, constant spending of money going on during this time. Reverend Toll, who's the guy in the upper right hand, maintained the church here with no particular focus on the Hispanic or any other community. So emblematically, like La Posada drops off the minute that Reverend Toll is here. And I'll show you the impact of that a little later. But he was running the church here, he was running the Sunday school classes, but it was very much in maintenance mode. So he brought a lot of talents to it, but outreach, it didn't expand. In the last year of his appointment, though, a woman named Reverend Gail Landis joined the staff, and she looked at the kitchen and she looked at the folks outside and said, let's have a homeless kitchen. And it's called Gail's Kitchen something. Sorry, I forgot. But there it is, Gail's Kitchen Angel. Read your slides. And so that homeless ministry starts 20 years ago, basically. So in the lower left-hand corner, this is Mike House. He was here from 2004 to 2007. He was, it turns out later, our first gay minister. So that's cool. Derek Wright here in the lower right-hand corner, he was our first Black senior pastor from 2007 to 2011. He had a lot going for him. He was a member of the cabinet before coming to Oak Lawn, the bishop's candidate, good preacher. He was not as good a husband as he was at some of these other things. And at the end of this period, he was actually stripped of his ordination over the way he was allegedly treating his wife. So under Mike House, the church began supporting Pride Week. And that's a long continuing process of more and more involvement. He brought in a guy named Tom Graves, who basically took the job for $1. He said, pay me $1 a year. And he came in for $1 a year. And then at the end or the middle of his tenure, he made a speech to the church, which was understood differently than I have the actual speech. And I want to spend some time with it. But it was understood as basically saying the church needs to close. But that's not what he was saying at all. Let me read you some of this speech. This guy had been around a long time, and he'd seen a lot of churches, and he had something to say specifically to the church. He said that we live in a place of change, and churches in the midst of a changing society face three options. One, they can embrace the change, rising to the challenge to be open and missional with new priorities and ways of service. Two, they can move to a new location and start over in a new area. Or three, they can remain in place and do things the way they've done in the past and die. He said, I was once a pastor in a church with the same choices. It was a drastically changing neighborhood and was on the campus of a fine United Methodist University. It had 1,600 members, approximately 5 times as many as Oak Lawn at that time. This church, after much discussion and study, chose to decline mission and a move. 20 years later, it had less than 100 members and has sold its education facilities to the university and struggles with a part-time pastor to maintain a Gothic cathedral built for 3,500. It will soon close, and its property will become an asset of the conference. And then he said, the Dallas landscape is littered with churches who've made the same choices. And then he lists 18 churches that had died in the last quarter of the 20th century, basically over white flight, looking at the list of names. Some have chosen, he said, to be a vital mission where they are, and after some transition are moving forward. And he listed First Dallas, and he listed Grace, and he listed Kessler Park. He listed a couple of other churches which have since died, but he listed those churches. And then he said this, the window of opportunity is open for Oak Lawn, but it is a window which must continue to be open if the wind of a fine future is to blow in. If we revert to past patterns, we will be voting to close this church, and in 20 years, it will be vacant. That speech was given in 2006. All this was by way of basically saying you need to engage the actual community you're in. Enough of the nostalgia. Derek Wright sent a report to the conference, and I think this, when I read this, I was so happy. He said, there is an emerging gay and lesbian community growing within the church. This, for some members, creates an uncomfortableness. Though this growing membership group, many have become part of the OLUMC leadership and have worked to demonstrate their desire to make OLUMC a stronger church for all people. Given the location of the church, the need for inclusivity is paramount if we're going to grow in membership. The result, as we'll see in the numbers, is that the old guard migrated away, and the old new guard migrated back in. So these two classes in the upper right-hand corner, these are both named after Cullums. So this is the Cullums men class, and this is the Tate class, which is a women class Mrs. Tate, Lillian Tate's middle name is Cullum, maiden name. And you can see this is in 1991, and in 2011, you can see there's 5 of them left. So they didn't, some of them died, but some of them moved on. Some moved to Highland Park, some moved to University Park, and people from the neighborhood moved back in, names that we will know now. Starting in 2010 and continuing now we have something that's recognizable to us as Oak Lawn. 2010, Greg Allen Smith, of beloved memory, was appointed as associate to the church. And to me, and he kind of embodies the new Oak Lawn. I mean, he's just, in the old days, we would be talking about renaming the church the Greg Allen Smith Memorial Methodist Church. I think I'll leave that on the table. In 2011 and 2012, we had some pretty good financial impact events. And so that you don't, when you look at the history of our church recently, you don't see the same precariousness that you do in some other smaller churches. That is not a situation we can rely on, but we have some runway. We should make use of it, because the building is still making very audacious demands on the congregation. And so we have to think about that. In 2016, the old New Guard and the New Guard came to Pastor Anna Hosman Butler and said, we want to be a reconciling church. And she says, that is not coming from me. You guys have to lead it. You bring it to me. And they did. It brought the church together. And in 2016, we became a reconciling church. This is not a small thing, and it continues not to be a small thing. 2018, we have continued migrations in. We have the homeless ministry in its current form. And, instead of like in the old days, we would feed them lunch. In new days, we invite them in, we baptize them, and we put them on the church board. And we give them the Denman Evangelism Award. So it's a very integrated approach to our friends. The marriage resolution, making sure that we can provide all the services that are available to all the members of the congregation. 2019, before COVID, Gracia Viva migrates in. Union Coffee, which had been homeless for 18 months as well, moves in. And we have literal migrants working out a deal with the government to be a way station for migrants as they come through. And then in 2010, I put this as nicely as possible, we achieved great success going 100% online, a technological, wonderful feat we should always be proud of. And then 2021, we had our first in-person service at the Easter Vigil 2 weeks ago, and it was wonderful. So these pictures are up in the upper right-hand corner. That's Frank Drenner, who was here from 2011 to 2013. He had been an intern here, and then he had been an associate here. And he came in after the turmoil of Derek Wright leaving, and he provided a great stabilizing influence. And I like him because he's an affable plus-size white guy with 2 chins. So he works for me. There's Greg. In the lower left-hand corner is Anna Butler Hosman. She's here from 2013 to 2017, our first female senior pastor. And then here's Rachel. And she is our first pastor with dreadlocks. So that's back in the day. Now, what I want to do is turn to the question of race at the church. First, let's talk in concept. These are various mission statements from the church over this 30-year period. I want you to look at them. This in 1991 talks about, it's very abstract and non-committal if you look at the words very hard. We're going to exemplify the saving grace of Christ in a particular place for such time as God will provide. But we're going to be in prayer always so that God's grace is offered to all times for all people. You never quite figure out how much of that is our job and how much of that is God's job here. By 1997, we're talking about congregational diversity. Still very general. That's something that you would see maybe at Highland Park United Methodist Church, where we're checking a box, not really very specific. 2005, these are the words of Mike House. He says he references race, he references orientation. And he says, we are going to reach out to our diverse neighborhood. In 2013, it talks about practicing the inclusion of all. It gives a specific date, which is, by the way, only 3 years from now, where and a specific goal of intentional inclusion of the people, not just intentional inclusion, but to be seen as being a place where there is intentional inclusion of all peoples. Now we're beyond trying. Now we're actually acting. And here is our reconciling statement, still in effect. We welcome people of all ages, races, sexual orientations, gender identities, and we commit to advocating for justice, which is why we're here, and full inclusion of all people in our congregation and in the community we serve. It's important to distinguish the sort of the headline of the church is the inclusion of gay, lesbian, and queer folk. And as Pastor Isabel said, it's not so obvious that naturally leads into issues of race, so that we need to be intentional about that because, well, this is her words. The Oak Lawn neighborhood sometimes feels very much like a white space for LGBTQI plus persons of color. That's from Pastor Isabel. So what are this is the concepts, what are the reality? These are columns taken from various years of the church, basically at 5-year intervals, starting off with where we were before all this craziness happened, the membership, and then this is the percentage white. And I do percentage white because you need to see what percentage the dominant race is to get a feel for how diverse the church is. If you look in these first 3 rows, this is 1988 when Gutierrez started, and a year before the 1989 vote, and 1995 is when he left. And remember, he did the effort to include the Hispanic community. And you can see the impact. There is basically a 4.5% swing in the percentage white. That is good, hard work. That is not an insignificant task. You can't do that just sitting in neutral. And I described what was going on with the next pastor. And you can see in the next numbers from 95 through 2005, how most of that is taken back. Just as it runs on autopilot, it attracts more white people than anyone else. It's kind of the nature of the program. And so you have to be very intentional about it. This number in 2006, 15, is super interesting because we drop out of the 90s all the way into the 70s. And there was a very significant racial shuffle then. I haven't got all the details of it. I have one version which I don't accept, but basically what happened is the number of members remains flat, but 24 plus white folks migrated out and 24 persons of color migrated in. So it's like a shuffle. Super interesting, and I can't wait to find out more about why that is. So keep those numbers in mind. Let's actually think about them for a minute, because like, I don't know about you, but that still seems like a lot of white folk to me. I want you to think about 3 numbers and interpreting them. First number is 97%, 94%, sorry. The next number is 80%, and the next number is 28%. So 94%, as you can see from this chart, is basically, that's the white ratio of the United Methodist Church. And that is true. I mean, you can see there's a little variation on age, but 94% that's how white the United Methodist Church. Only the Lutherans are whiter than we are. There's some very, not good, but there's some very distinct historical reasons for this.
Presbyterians are more diverse. Oh my God.
The Presbyterians are more diverse. You know what's embarrassing to me as a former Mormon is that Mormons are more diverse.
Oh my God.
I was like, no, sorry. Anyway, in the 1780s, the motions that started the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church started with basically bad treatment of Richard Allen and his friends. And they took their show on the road and created a mighty, mighty church, of which there are numerous congregations in our area. And here's a question to y'all. Do you all know where the closest ones are? Some African Americans stayed in the Methodist Church, not necessarily, remember, this is prior to the Civil War, not necessarily of their own free will. And so they, those that remained in the church after the Civil War in 1870 were put out by the white members of the Southern Church into what was called then the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, is now called the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. And there are congregations of that in this area as well. Those congregations, the AME, the AMEZ, and the CME are lopsidedly Black. I mean, in the 99 point something ratio. So that's the 94% figure to think about. The 80% figure is the measure that sociologists of religions use to determine how diverse a congregation is. They say basically, if you're 80%, you're actually diverse. And it's some mathematical thing where at 80%, everyone in the organization has to know and work with someone not of their own race. So that's the 80% figure. The 28% figure is actually 28.5%. And that's the percentage of non-Hispanic white people in Dallas County per the US Census figures in 2019. So you'll recall that we're at 75%. Let me get two more thoughts out, and then we can have a discussion. So we talked about the Oak Lawn Vision. Let's talk about the Oak Lawn Challenge. Here's that chart we just looked at. Instead of looking at the right column, let's look at the center column and look at those membership figures over the years. And what you see is a dropping figure from 1988, when we were 581. It took 2 years to drop 100 to 481, and that is largely the result of that church vote. The faithful gay Methodists said we will go elsewhere, and they did. Over the next 8 years, it dropped another 100 to 381. Between 1998 and sometime in 2008, it dropped to 281. And then sometime 18 months ago, it dropped to 181. So we talked about the Oak Lawn Vision. I want to throw, this is Kent offering an opinion. So I apologize. When I go to churches, I try to seek out churches that are integrated. And there's a scripture that they keep referring to. I mean, you know a lot of the scriptures, but there's one that they keep referring to, and it's Revelation 7:9, which reads like this. After this, I looked, and there was a great crowd that no one could number. They were from every nation, tribe, people, and language. They were standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They wore white robes and held palm branches in their hands. And that's quite a vision. And I thought, what if there was a 500-member church at Oak Lawn that looked like the Dallas community? And I did the math based on the census percentages from 2019. And here's what we have. This top row, like the 140, 15, 12, 4 is what we have. If we had a 500-member church that looked like Dallas County, there'd be 142.5 white people, 112 Black, 202 Hispanic, 31.75, split that how you want, Asian. And then in the last row, I put how much we'd have to increase. And the question is this, and it's not a simple question. We're going to soon grapple with the question of what racial justice looks like. What is it, if we're going to journey towards racial justice, what is that to us? And my belief is that it will be different for Oak Lawn. It'll be different for us than if you were to ask that same question to Highland Park Methodist Church. And if you were to ask that question to St. Luke's Community Church. Oak Lawn is it's a different answer, okay? I think that as we grapple with that, we need to grapple with the question of who it is that's answering that question, right? And how do we as a church address this 94% scandal of Methodism that was created in the 1780s and the 1870s? So, and that's about creating the congregation. And what would we need to do to create this congregation? Because we can see from our history that running it like we did, it runs white. That's not what we're after, I don't think. So we have to figure out what we want to do to create that congregation. And at some level, I'll put it out there, I think evangelism is the answer. So I'm going to unshare the screen and we can talk now, if I can, if my mouse will do that. Is that all right?
Absolutely.
I can't find my mouse.